Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the webinar on Going Beyond Bars and Lines, Effective Non-Standard Data Visualization. This webinar is part of the program of training, workshop and webinar program of the Publications Office of the European Union, and it's linked to the EU DataViz conference, which will take place on the 12th of November this year in Luxembourg. So if you are interested in the data visualization topics, please participate in this conference. There will be many interesting presentations and speakers about data visualization in public sector. My name is Ksenia Bocharova. I'm from Practising International and I'm facilitating this webinar today. Now I would like to give a word to our speaker of today, Maarten Lambrechts. Maarten.
Thank you, Ksenia. Good morning, everyone. I'm Maarten Lambrechts. I'm a data visualization consultant from Belgium, and I will be the trainer for this webinar. Before we really start with the webinar, let me introduce myself a little bit more. So I'm a data visualization consultant. I also work as a data journalist, and I specialize in helping organizations communicate their numbers. So I specialize in data visualization, so I make a lot of charts. I make static charts, interactive charts, and I also give trainings on data visualization. So today we are going to talk about non-standard charts, charts that you don't see every day, but that can still be very effective and that can help you communicate certain data sets or certain messages in your data. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a lot of these lesser known chart types, illustrate them with real-life examples, and in the end of the webinar we will also be talking about tools, because most of these charts will not be or cannot be produced with standard tools that most people use to make visualizations. So I'll also introduce some tools that you can use to make these kind of more exotic data visualizations. I would like to start with discussing this chart a little bit. This chart was published in a book in 1786. It was a book by Scottish engineer William Playfair. And in the book called The Commercial and Political Atlas, he published the first line charts ever made. So this is an example of this line charts. It shows you the exports and imports between England and Denmark and Norway, and halfway the chart you can see the balance of trade flip from against England to in favor of England. And when Playfair published this chart in his book, no one had ever seen anything like it. This was the first time that someone used visualization to communicate statistics. And so what Playfair did was he added a little text at the bottom of the chart. I don't know if you can read it, but it says the bottom line is divided into years and the right-hand line into £10,000 each. So he's helping the reader understand what he or she is looking at. He was giving a little bit of explanation because he knew that this was something that his readers would never have seen before. So he's helping the reader understand the chart. And in his book, he also added this little quote here. I'll read it to you. It remains only for me to request that those who do not at first sight understand the manner of inspecting the charts will read with attention the few lines of directions, after which they will find all the difficulty entirely vanish. So he's saying here that people will be able to understand new charts as long as you add a little explanation about how to read the chart. Playfair also invented the bar chart and the pie chart, so he kind of knew what he was talking about. He explained to his readers how they should read these charts, and most of his readers then all indeed understand the numbers that were presented to them in a visual way. The Image you see here is a screenshot of my Excel, my Microsoft Excel program, and what you see here is all the templates that Excel offers you as a user, and you can see that a lot of them are still bars, lines, and pies. So the things that William Playfair invented more than 200 years ago. There are some other chart types, but the gallery of templates is still quite limited. And I think that these templates that tools offer limit a little bit what we can make, what kind of visualizations what we can make, but also limit our imagination of what we could do with our data, or in what ways we could visualize our data. And so that is why in this training program, I also wanted a module about chart types that are lesser known, but still can be very effective. By the way, xenographics, the subtitle of this slide, is a word that I came up with to describe lesser known chart types. Xenos comes from Greek and means rare or strange, and the graphics are the visualizations. So these are weird visualizations or weird charts. But of course, this is very subjective. A scatter plot, for example, for many people will not be something weird, but for others it can be xenographic because they might have never been exposed to a scatter chart, and they might have difficulties reading these kind of charts. And one last quote here in the introduction. This is by Alberto Cairo. He is a professor of data visualization at the University of Miami, and he has a very interesting blog. He's very actively writing about visualization, and in one of his recent blog posts, he wrote this. So readers often have the unrealistic expectation that any graphic should be understandable without effort. We discard that expectation and we must stop. So he is saying that there is this kind of mantra that a visualization should be understood within seconds. And he says that we need to get rid of this because he also knows that sometimes we need to present our data in a more unfamiliar way to better convey the message hidden in the data. So we don't have to aim for very simple, simplistic visualizations. We can get a little bit more complex, but of course we need to take into account the things that William Playfair said, that we need to add some explanation about how to read a chart. Otherwise we will scare readers, or readers will not be able to understand visualizations. Then one first tool I want to show you already in the introduction is called the DataViz project, and I'll show it to you. So the DataViz project, you can find it at datavizproject.com, is a gallery of chart types. And if you can see, the gallery is quite large. You have, I think, over 50 different kinds of charts, and some are very familiar. You have classical line and bar charts there, but you also have other examples that are not so common. And the nice thing about the DataViz gallery is that you can click any of these and you'll get an explanation on about for what data you can use it, what the strengths and weaknesses are of each visualization, and you also get examples of this chart type being published somewhere in the news or somewhere online. You also have filtering capabilities. So if you want, for example, to show distribution, you can click distribution, and the gallery will filter and it will show you all visualizations that you can use to show distributions. There are other data visualizations galleries out there. I like this one very much because it shows you real-life examples for each of these chart types. So if you want to get inspired or you want to see what other kind of visualizations you can use for your data, then the DataViz project might be a good solution for you. We are going to see today a lot of visualizations that are included in the DataViz project, but we're also going to see other chart types that are not included in this catalog. So we're even going to go beyond what is included in this gallery. So let's start looking at some of these lesser known chart types. And the first thing I want to do is check some visualizations that you can make with dots. Dots are very simple, but they are also very flexible. And so you can make many different kinds of visualizations with these simple dots. So let's take a look at some of these examples. The first one is the dot plot, or you can also look at it as a unidimensional scatter plot or a categorical scatter plot, where you have different categories and then different data points associated with each category and which have then one numerical value. Usually the way this kind of data sets are presented is as group bar charts. For example, here for the A category, you would have a group of bars representing the numbers, but instead of bars, this visualization uses dots and the position of the dots to communicate the numbers. And this technique scales a little bit better than bar charts because in this case we have, I think, 8 data points for each category. If you have a group bar chart with 8 bars for 4 categories, then you'll run out of space quite easily. So this alternative way of representing the data is able to contain a lot more data points than when you would only use bars to communicate the numbers. So this is a first technique. One other thing that you cannot do with bar charts is starting the axis not at 0. So in this case, we are starting the numerical axis at 3000. If you have bars, then it is actually bad practice to cut bars. So then you need to start at 0. If you use this technique, then cutting the numerical axis is less problematic. So I said that this scales a little bit better than bar charts if you have lots of data points that you want to show. If you have tens or even hundreds of data points, then you will notice that you will run into the trouble of overplotting, that the dots will be plotted on top of each other and you cannot really see each individual data point. You will just get a smear of a color bar and you can't recognize each individual dot. So there are some techniques that you can use to handle overlap in these dot plots. And one of the techniques is using transparency. So what you're looking at are 589 dots, each one representing one Belgian municipality grouped into the 3 regions of Belgium. And because we have 589 dots, they are overlapping, but I added some transparency to the dots so you can identify where the clusters are in the data. You can see that Brussels, this is the category on the left, has 4 less municipalities than Flanders. Flanders has one big cluster here, so the data is about unemployment rates. And in Wallonia, you can see that the range is much bigger, and you have a cluster around 10%, and you have some values stretching all the way almost to 25%. So transparency can help you identify clusters when dots start to overlap. Another technique is using what is called jittering. And with jittering, you add some randomness to the position of the dots, and in this case, we are adding some randomness to the X position of the dots. This gives the dots even more space to be visible. And with this technique, we can see that we still have a very dense cluster here for the Flemish municipalities, while on the right, you can see that the density is much less. There you There the cluster contains less dots, there's less overlap there. So I'm combining transparency with jittering to make each dot better visible and make the clusters in the data more identifiable. So you can see that with these techniques, even plotting more than 500 points is still possible. And you can see the underlying trends in the data. An alternative way of presenting the same data is using another visual mark. So instead of dots, you could use lines or strips, and then you will end up with something like this. This is called a strip plot or a barcode plot because it resembles barcodes. And it is also a technique to pack more data into the same amount of space. And I have an example, a real-life example of this barcode plot. This was published by the Financial Times at the time where of the 2016 election, presidential elections in the United States. And the Financial Times wanted to communicate some key statistics for every state in the United States. And so they came up with these strip plots or barcode plots. Here we are seeing the statistics for Arizona. And you have different statistics here. You have wage growth, unemployment rate, poverty rate. And each time, each state is represented as a line. And there's also some transparency. So for example, for Hispanic population, you can see here on the bottom left that there are some clusters in the data. And the state we're looking at, Arizona, is highlighted in pink. So a lot of data can be packed in a limited amount of space if you use this technique of what is called the barcode plot. Another technique for showing distributions with dots is make the dots overlap, but let them stack on top of each other. And this is a technique called a B-swarm plot. And this allows you to show a little bit better how the distribution in the dots how the dots are distributed. So for example, if you use the technique, you can see that for the chart on the left, we have a bimodal distributions. We have two clusters in the data. The one in the middle is a normal distribution where you have a lot of points in the middle and a few outliers on either side. And the one on the right is just, there's not really cluster in the data. The data is distributed uniformly over the whole range. I also have an example, a real-life example of these B-swarm plots to illustrate how they work. So what you are looking at are the medal counts for the Olympic Summer Games in 2016, and each dot represents a country. And the first B-swarm plot here on the left represents total medals won per country. The one in the middle is per 10,000 people, and the one on the right is per athlete. So the total medals won per country per athlete. And you can see that for total medals won per country, you have a big cluster at the bottom. So a lot of countries only winning a few medals. And the one at the top here is the United States. They won the most medals. If we take population into account, it's Grenada that won the most medals. And then if we look at the numbers relative to the number of participating athletes, it was Azerbaijan that won the most medals. So with three B-swarm plots, you'll get a distribution. You get the distribution of these numbers for all the countries, and this kind of visualization is also using something that we will see at the end of this webinar. This is also using the technique of parallel coordinates. So you actually have three different B-swarms and they are connected. So you can see the data values for each country. If you hover over any of the dots, you can see the connecting lines. So this is a technique called parallel coordinates, and we will come back to that later in this webinar. So those are the B-swarm plots. When you have a B-swarm plot, you can use other visual attributes of the dots. You can use the color, but you can also use the size of the dots to encode other aspects or other numbers contained in your data. So at this moment, we are looking at a B-swarm plot showing the amount of risk that countries are experiencing from water stress. They are organized by continent, so you have the Americas on the left, Europe is there in the middle, and each dot represents a country, and the size of the dots or the bubbles represents the population. And if you use this technique, then you can see that the country with the highest amount of number of people with a high risk of experiencing water stress is India. So it's the biggest circle over here, and it has also this intense orange hue, so you can clearly identify that there are the most people at risk of experiencing water stress. So these are 4 B-swarm plots, but added to the B-swarm are the color of the dots and also the size of the dots. Then when you use dots, you can also connect the dots. What you see here is called a dumbbell chart, and it's a very good visualization if you want to show the gaps between 2 different countries, between 2 different categories. We will see an example soon, a visualization that shows gaps between categories. Of course, this can also be a dumbbell chart in a horizontal way. If you rotate it 90 degrees, then you will also have a dumbbell chart. And this chart type is also something that's the connected dot plot. So let me show you an example. This is a visualization showing the difference in pay between men and women for different jobs or different category of jobs. So you have one value for female, those are the purple dots, and one value for male, those are the light green dots. But in this visualization, the individual values for men and women are not what is important. What is important is actually the gap. So you can use a simple line to connect the dots between men and women, and this is actually what this chart is about. So it's not about the individual values for men and women, it's about the gap. And of course, if the message in your data is about a gap, then you probably need to have a visualization that can show you the gap, and the dumbbell chart is one way of showing gaps between categories. An alternative or a variation of the dumbbell chart is what is called an arrow chart. If you replace the dots on a dumbbell chart by on one hand, just remove the dot, and on the other hand add an arrowhead, then you get an arrow chart, and this is a nice way of showing the evolution of numbers between different categories. So here I'm highlighting the numbers or the categories where the numbers went up in blue, and the ones where the numbers went down in red. And this gives you a kind of dynamic chart that clearly shows you the movement in the numbers. The structure of the chart is a bit the same as a dumbbell chart, but now you also have a direction of things moving up or moving down. So let me also show you an example of an arrow chart. This is from an article by the New York Times about the richest people in different countries and how their wealth even got higher. So you can see the arrow chart here, and the title of the chart is where the 1% have gained the most, and you can see that the largest arrow is in Russia, where the top 1% of the richest people now own 20% of the wealth, while it was only 3% a few years back. So a nice way of showing evolution between different categories, in this case between different countries. And you can also see that there is no country where the arrow points to the left. So the richest people in different countries, they got richer in all countries in this data set. So that is an arrow chart. And the last visualization technique with dots is what is usually called a bubble chart. And a bubble chart is very good at showing you many different dimensions in your data set. And the most classical example of this bubble chart was developed by a Swedish professor called Hans Rosling, and he used a bubble chart to tell some data stories about statistics of different countries. So some of you might recognize this chart. Each dot or each bubble on the chart is a country, and the size represents the population of the countries, and the position in the Y direction is the income, the average income for each country, and the Y position is life expectancy. Then you also have the color, and color represents the different regions of the world, as you can see from the little map on the top right. So we already have 4 dimensions in this visualization. We have the income, the life expectancy, population, and the regions of the world. Then what Professor Hans Rosling did was make this chart an animated chart. So if I click the play button here, the chart will start animating. Are we still online? It's a bit of a delay. So you can also add a 5th dimension, which is time, and then you will end up with an animated bubble chart. So you can pack a lot of data into this visualization. And nowadays, many software also offer a template for making this kind of visualizations. So after dots, we will see some examples of charts that use bars, but those will not be your standard bar charts. These are different kinds of charts that also use bars. So let's see how we can be a little bit more creative with bars. The first one I wanted to share is what is called a bullet chart. And a bullet chart is actually a very simple kind of visualization that can help you communicate progress or the status towards a goal for any kind of data that you are regularly following up. So I think the next slide will show you how a bullet chart is constructed. So you have a little indicator here, a vertical line showing you a measure that is used to compare your current progress. So this might be a target value, or this might be the value of the indicator that you had last year. And so it's allowing you to compare the current status or the progress that you are making for this indicator in this particular moment in time. And the actual value is the bar in the middle of the bullet chart, so the dark black bar. And then behind it in the background, you have some shaded areas that show you whether you are in the zones where you don't want to be, the danger zones, if you like, or the zones where you want your indicator to end up with. So in this case, we are looking at revenue year to date, and you can see that we are already over the that was set for the next chart that we are looking at, called the macro chart or a mosaic plot, and you can use it to show two kinds of shares that different categories have. And it's a bit difficult to explain with just this example this example of a very macro chart we're looking at. So I'm going to show you a real life example. This is a visualization produced by the World Bank, and it is used to show the share of poor people in different continents or different regions in the world for two moments in time. So on the left we have 1990, and on the right we have 2013. And if we check the bar for sub-Saharan Africa, which is the second one from the bottom, we can see that the share of poor people is equal to, or was equal to 54.4% in 1990, while it was 41 in 2013. So the share of poor people went down. But the way a Marimekko chart works is that you also scale, in this case, the height of the bars, and the height of the bars in this visualization are scaled according to the total population of each continent. And you can see that the bar representing sub-Saharan Africa is much higher in 2013 than it was in 1990. So what happens is, and this is actually also explained in this annotation here, is the share of poor people went down, but because the population in sub-Saharan Africa grew quite considerably between those 2 years, the absolute number of people living in poverty is actually higher in 2013 than it was in 1990. And you can see that the surface area of the red bar for sub-Saharan Africa is smaller in 1990 than it is for the one in 2013. So with the Marimekko chart, you can both show relative numbers, the percentages in this visualization, and the absolute numbers, which are of these rectangles. Okay, after bars, we are going to look at some ways in which you can show evolution over time, because usually those kind of data is presented as a line chart, but we can also use other techniques to show trends over time. And the first visualization that I wanted to highlight is what is called a slope chart, and you can use a slope chart to compare two moments in time. So this example of a slope chart is showing the values for 4 categories in 2 years, so in 2005 and 2015. And you can see that for some categories there is an upward trend, and for others there is a downward trend. Important to note here is that the data points in between are left out. There's no indication of what happened in 2010, for example. So the slope chart only compares 2 moments in time. And if you think back to the arrow chart we saw, it's the same kind of data that you visualize. But what the slope chart gives you is a ranking, both on the left and on the right. I'll show you a real-life example that I made some time ago. This is a chart showing the share of older people in the population of 13 Flemish cities. And you can see that the share of older people went up for most of the cities. But for 4 cities, the trend is downward. So I also played with color here. So the blue lines going down are the cities that have a share of older people that's lower than what it was some years ago. And you can clearly see that we now have a nice ranking on the right, and you can add some the labels there for the cities and also the data labels. So a slope chart can be a very nice way of showing the trend between two moments in time. Only difficulty is if you have a lot of dots overlapping in the ranking on the right, then you will have a hard time labeling each line or each dot. It's also a technique that is very data dense, so you can put a lot more data in this visualization than a bar chart that would only use the same amount of space. Then there is the horizon chart, and this is a bit more abstract and also a bit harder to understand. These are area charts with a high data density. And to show you how it works, I would like to share this little animation here. So if you want to make a horizon chart, what you need to do is divide your chart into bands. In this case, we also have negative values, and we flip the negative values to upwards. But we use different colors for positive and negative values. We divide the chart into bands, we flip the negative values upwards, and then we stack the different bands on top of each other, and we make sure that the highest values are represented by the darkest colors. And what you will end up with is something like this. So this was published in a Dutch financial newspaper some years ago. It shows you the effect of the financial crisis. It shows you the effect of the financial crisis for different stocks at the Dutch stock exchange, and it's using the technique of the horizon chart. And you can see the dark red colors on the right. Those are the stocks that suffered the most from the economic crisis and that went down the most. I'm not sure how many stocks are represented on this page. I think there are almost 60. If you would make a line chart with 60 lines, that would be very hard to read. So the horizon chart allows you to pack a lot of data into the same space while still be readable. And if you look at this little explanations over here, those are the frames of the animation that we just showed. They explain to the reader how they should read this horizon chart. Then you can also show trends over time with a heat map. And usually a heat map is used to show numbers where two different categorical dimensions overlap. So in this example, we have 4 categories in the X direction, A, B, C, D, and we have 9 of them in the Y direction. And each cell in this heat map or in this matrix is shaded according to some numerical value in the data. But you can also replace the categorical x-axis, the categories A, B, C, D, with time. And then you will get something like this, which is a quite well-known visualization. It became quite famous. It's a heat map showing the vaccination or the effect of vaccination on different diseases in the United States. So what you're looking at is the infection rate of measles in different states, in the different states of the United States. And the horizontal line represents the moment in time where the vaccine was introduced. And you can clearly see that infection rates went down quite considerably after the vaccine was introduced. So the visualization is showing the effect of vaccination on infection rates. And on this page, you have also the same chart, but for different diseases. The authors of this chart, they use the heat map technique, but they are using the x-axis as a time axis. So this is also a technique for showing many time series at once. Then the last technique to show time series is what is called a connected scatter plot, and this is also one of the lesser known techniques that are a bit harder to understand how they work. So let me try to explain to you how this chart works. So we have two numerical axes, and in this case we have the amount of miles or kilometers driven by people in the United States on the x-axis. So if we go to the right, that means that people are using their cars more. And the y-axis is the number of fatalities per 100,000 people. So if we go up in this chart, that means that there are more accidents and more traffic or more victims from traffic accidents. So each dot represents 1 year, and the dots are connected chronologically. So if you look closely, you can see the little arrows. We start in 1960 here on the left, all the way up to I think it's 2012 or 2011 here on the right. And you can see the general downward trends, and we also move to the right. That means that on average, people drive more now than they used to in the 60s, but traffic also became safer because the line is moving down. But there are some interesting bits happening in this chart, and this is also explained in the annotations. Here, halfway in the chart, we suddenly go up. That means more traffic victims, so a lot more accidents. That was a time where cars became more powerful, but there were not a lot of safety rules, so there were a lot more victims. And here you can see a little loop. Here is where the line or the arrows go from right to left, which means that in these years, people drove less with their cars than they did before. So this is the effect of the oil crisis at the beginning of the 70s. So if you want to show two numerical values at once over time, then you could consider this chart type. It's called a connected scatter plots, where you don't have a time axis. The time is encoded in the connection between the dots. So if you go to true time, you have to follow the arrows. So this might be an option if you want to show the trend in two values at once over time. This is the same kind of chart, but now only showing two moments in time. So it's a bit related to the slope chart that we've seen, but it's actually also a connected scatter plot where we are connecting the dots from one time period with the dots for another time period. Okay, let's discuss components and hierarchy now. Some data sets contain information about hierarchies, how things belong to other things at a higher level in the hierarchy. And there are some interesting ways that you can use to show this kind of data. The first one is called a waterfall chart, and a waterfall chart can show you the net effect of different components. In this case, we have a start value at 8 and an end value at D, and you can see that the values for B and C add up to the net effect that they change between A and D. I also have another example of the waterfall chart showing you how the ice in glaciers melted in a specific year, but they are arranged in a way that you can also see the cumulative effect. You have some years here in the 60s, for example, where the ice grew instead of disappearing, and so there you have a rectangle going up. But you can see that all together, if you add up all the rectangles, all the components, you have a net effect of a large amount of ice disappearing. So this is also using the technique of the waterfall chart. Then you have something what is called a dendrogram. You can see an example here on the right, and you can use a dendrogram to show hierarchies that have multiple levels. So you have a structure where you have a top level that's broken down into sub-levels, and those sub-levels are then again also broken down into lower levels of the hierarchy. Let me show you an example of a chart that I made that is also using this technique. In my case, I used a circular layout of the hierarchy. What you are looking at are more than 200 brands of beers and where they are sold in different countries of the world. So the inner ring of this visualization shows you the continents, and the next ring are countries, and then the outer ring are the different kinds of beers. So you can see where different beers are sold. So it's a geographical data set, but I decided not to show a map, but use this hierarchical structure to show where all the different kinds of beers are sold. First at the level of countries, then also at the level of continents, and finally the whole circle represents the world. So this is a circular dendrogram. You can also have a regular dendrogram, then you would have all the text, brands of beer having horizontal text. Then if you have a hierarchy and if there are numbers attached to each element in the hierarchy, then you can make something what is called a tree map. So a tree map can be used to both show a multi-level hierarchy and the numbers attached to this hierarchy. I think this is a nice example of a tree map. This is a tree map used to show the structure of the American labor market, and it has 3 levels. So you can already see in this view that the 3 levels on the top level of the hierarchy are government goods and services. Those are also used to color the rectangles. So you have blue for government and red for goods, for example. But within each top level in the hierarchy, we have the sub-level, and for government, you can see that those are the federal governments, state governments, and local governments. And then within each of these elements of the sub-level, you have a further breakdown of where people work. So in local government, you have things like general administration, education, transport, and hospitals. So we have a 3-level hierarchy of the labor market in the United States, and each rectangle in this visualization represents the number of people working in each sector of the labor market. So the surface area of each rectangle represents the number of people working in those specific areas. So that's a tree map with which you also can communicate numbers and not only the structure of the hierarchy. Then some techniques to show multiple columns in your data at once. So visualization techniques to show multi-dimensional data, and we've briefly touched on this already earlier. And the first technique to show many columns in your data at once is called parallel coordinates. And I think this will also become a little clearer if we can show an example. So this is a data set about people training to run a marathon, and those people, they tracked a lot of data when they were performing the runs to train to run a marathon. So for example, we have the training dates. This is the first column, the miles run for each training, the training time, the shoe brand they used, the running pace per mile. So many different columns from the data shown at once, and each line represents one specific run. You have many lines in this visualization, and with the technique of parallel coordinates, you see the correlations between the columns in your data. If you have a lot of lines connecting different areas on the axis in this visualization, that means that you have a strong correlation between those values. And notice that you can have both numerical axis, time axis, and categorical axis in this visualization. So it's a really flexible way to show many different kinds of data at once. And if you think back at the visualization showing you the medal counts for different countries, this was also using the technique of parallel coordinates, where countries were linked to between the different bee swarms in the visualization. A bit related to parallel coordinates are alluvial diagrams, and they can show you the breakdown of larger data sets between different categories. I'm going to quickly show how you can make this with one of the tools. So I'm going to also introduce a tool here. But first, I would like to explain how these alluvial diagrams work. So we were looking at this visualization showing the breakdown of the passengers of the Titanic into different categories. On the left, you have the breakdown by gender. So you see the share of female passengers and male passengers. Then in the next step, you have the breakdown by age group. You can see that a lot of young people were on board between 20 and 29. The next step shows you the breakdown by class that people were traveling in, first, second, and third class. And then the last part of the chart shows you whether people survived the Titanic disaster or not. So here you can see that many of the people traveling in third class did not survive the disaster. So this is on the website of the tool called Raw Graphs. So there is a section about learning to work with raw graphs there. So this is actually a tutorial that is describing how you can use the tool. I invite you to take a look over there. In Raw Graphs, you find many templates that we already have discussed as well. So you can make dendrograms, for example, with raw graphs. You can make parallel coordinates with raw graphs, and also horizon charts. This is the first tool that I would like to mention. It's very user-friendly, and it also has some nice tutorials to get you started. Then some techniques to communicate uncertainty. And the first technique is called a fan chart, and this is usually used when some projections are calculated. So think about projections about GDP growth, for example. There's always a range of uncertainty in those projections. And with the fan chart, you can indicate that the thing that people are looking at are not very certain, they are not set in stone, that there's an amount of variability, and so fan charts can communicate uncertainty. And I have an example here. So the European Central Bank is already using this technique. So they are publishing charts like this that shows that the projected values are actually a range of possible outcomes. And this is an interesting article on Business Insider explaining that the American Central Bank also wanted to use this technique for communicating uncertainty, but there was some discussion about whether or not people would be able to understand what this fan chart means. I think they should use this technique because whenever there is uncertainty in the data, I think it's a good idea to also show the uncertainty in the data. So those are fan charts used to communicate uncertainty in projections. This is a visualization showing you the uncertainty in poll results. So you are looking at the scores of political parties in the Netherlands, but the author of the chart decided to also show the confidence intervals. And then you can see that, for example, here you have two ranges on top of each other, which means that the confidence intervals are overlapping. And this means that we cannot say with a high amount of certainty that one value is higher than another for that specific moment in time. So also for confidence intervals, you can use this technique to show the uncertainty in the data. Here are some more techniques that you can use to show confidence intervals. The top two ones, they even show different confidence intervals for different levels of confidence. And as you can see at the bottom, you can also use transparency or gradients to communicate uncertainty. So many techniques that you can use to convey the uncertainty that is inherent to the data. Before talking about some other tools, I wanted to briefly also talk about things that you can do to introduce those lesser known chart types to readers, because many of the readers will not be familiar with them. So you need to help them to show how they should read those charts. And there are three things that I wanted to highlight here. One is to add how to read this chart description in the text surrounding the chart, so people can just read how they should read the chart. But you can also add things to the chart itself, so add human readable access labels, for example. I'll show you an example in a minute. And also add explanatory annotations that that explain how the chart works, or what people are looking at really. So the example I wanted to show is by the New York Times. It's from an article explaining how the subway in New York City became more or less reliable for the different routes on the subway. There are some other interesting visualizations in this article. So here you can see a bee swarm, for example. This is a heat map, which we've already also discussed. But I wanted to focus on this visualization here. The text here says the chart below is somewhat abstract, but it does a relatively efficient job of showing the modest improvement of New Yorkers' commutes. And at the bottom here, there's a whole explanation about the horizontal axis and the vertical axis. So this is the how to read this chart technique that you can use to introduce lesser known chart types. Then you also have this annotation here for the y-axis. It says how much the slowest strips changed, and you have these little labels here saying 5 minutes faster, 5 minutes slower. We also have the same on the x-axis here, so how much typical trips changed, 2 minutes faster, 3 minutes slower. So those are human readable labels. It doesn't just say 3M, for example, or minus 3M. It says 3 minutes slower. So it's making the data better understandable by making these labels using natural language instead of just using numbers. And then we also have these annotations here that is saying that 61% of commutes have become faster and also more reliable. So the annotations are also used to explain how the chart works. Then one last technique that you can use to introduce those lesser known chart types is to explain or add chart elements in sequence, so that people get a sense of how a chart works by having the functionality of the chart explained in steps. So this is what is called a ternary plot. It's used to show how things are distributed into three components, and it is used a lot in soil sciences because soils are composed of three components: sand, silt, and clay. And so what you can do if you want to explain how this chart works is first explain, well, the amount of sand in a soil should be read on this axis here. So this is the left axis. The amount of silt in the soil is read on the next axis. So we should read those values on the bottom axis. And then finally we have clay, and these values should be read from the right axis. And then you can show the composition of one particular soil type, for example. And if you explain in steps how people should read a chart, now they can understand how this soil type is composed of these three elements. Let me briefly show you where this comes from. This comes from a website called Ternary Plot, and an excellent explanation about how this chart works. They also have an interactive tool that you can use to produce these kind of charts. So if you're interested in making this kind of specific chart, then you can use this tool. You can also make an animated GIF or a video to explain how a chart works. We've seen this technique for the horizon chart. Animations can really be an excellent way of explaining how a chart works. Then the final part about tools, I've already mentioned raw graphs, which I think is an excellent tool to make many kinds of exotic visualizations that you cannot make in Microsoft Excel, for example. You can find it at rawgraphs.io. There's no coding required to make visualizations with raw graphs. It's copy-paste data and selecting a template and then configuring your visualization. So what you see here comes from their gallery, all kinds of visualizations made with raw graphs. Another tool that you can use to make custom visualizations is called Charticulator. You can find it at charticulator.com. We're also looking at the gallery of Charticulator here, and you can see all kinds of different visualizations that you can not make with day-to-day tools that most of us use. So if it allows you to make more creative visualizations without having the need to program. A bit similar to Charticulator is Data Illustrator, which you can find at data-illustrator.com. And it's using a different strategy, but as you can see from the gallery, you can make many different kinds of visualizations with it. And if you look closely here at the gallery, we are looking at some parallel coordinates over here on the left in the middle, and we have a heat map on the bottom left, and we have a slope chart here in the middle. So already some examples of charts that we've seen today that you can make with Data Illustrator. Finally, I would like to mention the ChartMaker directory, which is a large collection of tools crossed with a large collection of different chart types. So this is on the visualizingdata.com website, and you can find there this giant matrix. Each column in the matrix is a tool, and each row in the matrix is a chart type. So we have bar chart, a bullet chart, waterfall chart, and each dot in the matrix is a link to a tutorial about how to make this specific chart type with that specific tool. So for example, if we go here to the column representing Microsoft Excel, you can see there are a lot of dots there, so a lot of tutorials. If we want to make a waterfall chart with Microsoft Excel, we just click the dot in the cell there, and we'll get a tutorial about how to make a waterfall chart in Microsoft Excel. So if you're looking for some guidance about how to make a certain chart type with the tool that you're using, you can consult the chart maker directory, and it will probably point you into the right direction to get you started making this visualization. So those were all the charts that I wanted to show to you, and I hope you have gotten some inspiration on how you can represent your data a little bit different than the classical ways of representing data. Make sure that your reader understand what you're showing to them, so use any of the techniques that we've discussed to help the reader understand the chart. And then finally, I would invite you to experiment a little bit with the tools I mentioned, especially raw graphs, which is very easy to use. I hope to have inspired you, and I also hope that you will making these non-standard visualizations in the future. So at this time, we still have some time for the Q&A, for questions and answers. So you can post your questions in the chat, and I'll try to answer them.
Thank you very much, everyone, for participating in today's webinars. It will be made available for you, both presentation and the recording very soon. We wish you a nice day.